Welcome back everybody. So in the last video we talked about the economic theories of one individual, namely Milton Friedman. He believed in a theory called economic shock therapy. It was largely based on the ideas of shock therapy which were used in psychology, which were developed by doctors such as Dr. Ronald Cameron, and they relied on shocking a patient to its core in order to then be able to rebuild their personality. That was the psychological theory. Now, Milton Friedman used this theory on economics. So he believed that if you would shock a country to its core, you would be able to rebuild their economy from this. Now, what's interesting about his theories is that Milton Friedman often presented these theories as the staple mark of democracy. He believed that his theories would be able to establish a pure form of capitalism, exactly how an economy is supposed or intended to work and how it would work the best. However, when we look at the countries where his economic theories were actually implemented, and as we did in the last video, we looked at Chile and Argentina, we actually see that in these countries, there's not really that much democracy to speak about. And many of his theories, his reforms, rely on the population being in shock, being in a state in which they cannot resist these reforms because these reforms are not popular. Most people would not like these reforms and most people would not want to see these reforms implemented. And Milton Friedman, to a certain extent, acknowledged this. He believed that a state of shock is something that you can profit from and this should be seen as an opportunity for economic reform. And this specific belief is also termed disaster capitalism. Now, I talked about these stuff in my previous two videos. If you haven't seen them yet, I definitely recommend checking them out before watching this one. And those videos, and including this one, are all based on this book, The Shock Doctrine, written by Naomi Klein. Now, today we will go further into what I promised in the previous video, namely looking at some examples outside of South America of these economic reforms having very similar results there. So as I mentioned at the end of the last video, President Nixon, who was president at the time Milton Friedman was rising in popularity, actually used very different reforms than the ones Milton Friedman advised to him. Because when the US at the time was suffering under high inflation, high unemployment and high homelessness, he decided to go for a more leftist approach and applied policies which ended up leading to more government involvement in the economy, something that Milton Friedman heavily advised against. However, Milton Friedman did not have to wait long before somebody was put in power in the US who actually did support his view, and that was Ronald Reagan. Reagan wasn't the only one who answered Friedman's prayers. Across the Atlantic, another person was elected who was very favorable to Friedman's advice, namely Margaret Thatcher. Now, Reagan and Thatcher were both heavily inspired by Friedman, and Friedman in return praised Reagan and Thatcher and their dedication to executing his style of reforms. And Thatcher is especially a very peculiar case here because she was very well aware of how these economic reforms turned out in Chile. Even when commenting on Chile's reforms, she said that those type of reforms could not be done in democratic nations and with consent. But Thatcher still decided to execute many of Friedman's reforms in cutting government expenditure, and this led to her being very unpopular and having to deal with a lot of riots in her country because her country was not yet in a state of shock. So when she started implementing these reforms, she was met with a lot of resistance because her country was not shocked to an extent where the population would just blindly accept anything. A state of shock which we had seen earlier in Chile and Argentina with the military juntas. To a certain extent, luckily enough for Thatcher, this state of shock came very soon in the form of the Falklands War. The war itself seems a bit silly to fight such a war for a simple island group. But what it allowed Thatcher to do in her own country is much more significant. Because after the military action in the Falklands War and after Thatcher's re-election, Thatcher decided to push many of the reforms that were similar to the ones in Chile. And she mainly focused on privatizing national resources. This was met again with a lot of strikes, especially from the miners' unions. And she responded to these strikes by using the police and using violent police force to shut them down. She declared war to a certain extent again on the labor unions. And this was successful and it allowed her to privatize so much more. I mean, she privatized the British steel industry, the water industry, electricity, gas, telephones, airlines, oil. She privatized all these core industries, and these industries went then to global companies who earned a huge profit from this privatization, if you look at the gap between the wage of an average worker and the CEO, this would be about 10 times as much, where a CEO would earn 10 times as much as an average worker. Now, this was before Thatcher. After Thatcher's reforms, this gap increased to 100 times. A CEO of a company would on average earn 100 times more than the average worker. So it's quite clear to see who benefited most from these privatizations executed by Thatcher. And Thatcher was not alone in this. No, across the ocean, Reagan did some very similar reforms, and we see the similar results in the US as well. Well, before Reagan, an average CEO would earn about 43 times as much as an average worker. But after Reagan, this gap increased to 400 times. So once again, in the US, it's also very clear to see who benefited most from these reforms. And still, Friedman acknowledged both Reagan and Thatcher as being of high importance for the popularity of his reforms and for spreading his reforms across the world. Thatcher even visited Solidarity, who at the time was still a labor union. And you can see the irony there. Thatcher, who was crushing and violently oppressing unions at home, then going to Poland to express her support even of a labor union there, who at the time was huge in Poland. And Poland is another very interesting case, or more so, the fall of the Soviet Union is a very interesting case. During the 80s, many in the USSR did want democracy, did want some power to be able to choose for themselves, because the USSR, the Soviet Union, was at the time very much an autocratic regime who did not allow any sense of democratic elections. But they had one person in power who wanted to change this, who wanted to allow the people more democracy, and this was Gorbachev. Gorbachev wanted to allow the people more free will, more autonomy in general. And he, more importantly, did not want to go straight for communism, nor did he want to go straight for capitalism. Gorbachev wanted to find a third way and wanted to transition slowly from the communist economic policies which were in place to a more third way route and not directly going to capitalism. However, the economic state of the Soviet Union at the time was not doing very well. So Gorbachev was forced to seek help from the West. And the West, more specifically the US, told him, yes, we will support you, but only if you implement our extreme neoliberal economic reforms of capitalism. And when he accepted this deal, he was actually met with a lot of opposition from some communist hardliners, who in return went to the Russian White House and actually launched a military campaign against it. So they attempted a coup. But this coup wasn't successful. It had actually the exact opposite result of what they wanted. Namely, it put one person in the spotlight and brought him a lot of power, and this person was Boris Yeltsin. After the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, which came as a surprise to many in Russia, Yeltsin was put into power of the Russian economy. He was the person who was going to have to deal with these economic reforms. And what he did is he decided to go full capitalism and introduce the free market to Russia, which was immediately met with a lot of chaos. I mean, Russia at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union was often described as a new Wild West. And what happened is that only a small handful of businessmen actually profited from this turn to capitalism. And this is also what created the system of oligarchs who would control Russia and who still do to this date. But what's peculiar about this is that Yeltsin's economic reforms, and especially his advisors, were once again dubbed the Chicago Boys. These were once again people from the camp of Friedman's ideology. And if we then compare these reforms and especially the results, we once again see that 1 year after the reforms, the average Russian would consume 40% less. A third fell below the poverty line and wages weren't paid for months. But the majority of the Russians also opposed the reforms. The parliament even attempted to strip Yeltsin from his powers. However, Yeltsin simply, in response, dissolved the parliament. I mean, later he went even further and launched his own coup against the parliament, where he would bomb the Russian White House, the very same building he had defended years earlier against the communist hardliners. He used the military to bomb his own parliament building in order to create shock and terror to push his reforms, which were deeply unpopular with the local population. Now you might find yourself asking, what was the response of the West, the staple of democracy, against this very much undemocratic action. Now, their response was actually very favorable to Yeltsin. They supported him fully. US officials even went as far to say that this was simply a step necessary to bring democracy and to bring capitalism to Russia. Now, after 8 years of Yeltsin's reforms, which were mainly focused on the privatization of state industries, thousands of factories closed and more than 70 million people fell into poverty. Yet at the same time, Moscow contained the most billionaires in the world. You can see the clear gap between who benefited most from these economic reforms, and it were definitely not the local population. And now you might find yourself asking, Thibaut, you've been very quick to blame the US to a certain extent for many of things, but it was never the US who were directly involved in this. And you're completely right for pointing that out. The US was not directly involved. They did give funding, they did give military weapons to many of these regimes who implemented these reforms, and they did help them, but they were never directly involved in the sense of that they sent their army there. But this changed with the War on Terror, which started in 2001. Now, before the war started, Donald Rumsfeld, another admirer of Friedman's ideologies, decided to privatize the US military, something that even Friedman himself went on to say that you should not privatize the US military. That was one of the few state industries which he believed should not be privatized. Rumsfeld, in his famous speech, declared war on bureaucracy, and more specifically on the bureaucracy of the Pentagon. Now, he gave this speech and he implemented these reforms on the 10th of September 2001, the day after 9/11 happened. Now, 9/11 caused huge amount of shock and terror among the US population, and this also led to the start of the War on Terror and to the US invasion of Afghanistan. And what's very peculiar and disturbing about this war and about the start of this war is that it saw many businesses which were very insignificant before the events of 9/11 suddenly rose to power and rose to being hugely significant, hugely powerful in the US. One of these companies being Homeland Security. It's a perfect example of an economy that was built, or at least that rose on disaster, on fear. As I mentioned, the War on Terror started by invading Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the Taliban was quickly overthrown and many prisoners were taken, and they were put in the prison in Guantanamo Bay, a prison that is now infamous for its use of torture. And the methods that they implemented were actually the very same methods implemented by the Chilean and Argentinian military juntas, namely the ones that were described in the Cubac interrogation manual. If you haven't seen it, I discussed it in the last video as well. It was a manual created by the CIA, and it was actually built on their findings in the larger MKUltra research which also benefited mainly from the contributions of Dr. Donald Cameron. Now, this manual discussed certain techniques such as using narcotic drugs, think of LSD, using electroshock therapy, and more specifically using sensory isolation or deprivation and sensory overload to just break the mental power of a person. Essentially to shock somebody to its core and then get any type of information you want from them. Now, many of the prisoners taken to Guantanamo Bay over the years were taken and held without any charge and then released without any further explanation given. And out of the 779 prisoners taken to Guantanamo Bay, taken there and tortured, only 3 had ever been convicted. Now, after Afghanistan, after overthrowing the Taliban there, at least for some time, the US decided to invade Iraq and able to dismantle Al-Qaeda, who they believed was responsible for 9/11. But what's very interesting is that if the US was looking for a target to destroy Al-Qaeda, Pakistan would have been the much more logical choice. In Pakistan, Al-Qaeda was way bigger than in Iraq, but Iraq had the world's largest oil reserves, so therefore Iraq was the choice of the US military. The most amount of bombs that were ever released in history were released on the first day of the Iraq invasion. And mainly Baghdad was targeted, and the citizens of Baghdad described it as the city suffering a complete blackout. Many key infrastructures for the city were bombed, and the city changed into a war zone overnight. You can imagine the amount of shock this would create in a people who up until then living a relatively peaceful life, to then suddenly live in a complete war zone, and this change happening in, well, less than a couple of hours. I mean, the shock must have created on these people is incomprehensible, but it gets so much worse. After the bombing of Baghdad and Iraq, huge amounts of looting followed, and this was actually not at all resisted by the US, because the US saw this looting as part of a larger plan for the reset of Iraq, or a fresh start. When the US started to fully occupy Iraq, they began by implementing huge economic reforms, and all of them implemented along the agenda of disaster capitalism, along the idea of being able to do anything because the population is too shocked to respond. Many of these economic reforms are, once again, very much in line with this video, are those of neoliberal ideas and of Friedman's advice. Now, the US promised to rebuild Iraq, and in order to be able to do this, they sent huge amounts of money, billions and literal billions and billions of US dollars to Iraq in order to rebuild that country. But this money was mainly spent on US companies. They did not hire already established Iraqi companies in order to rebuild their country. In fact, they did not even hire Iraq civilians. No, instead they decided to get US companies to go to Iraq, to get US personnel to go to Iraq, and then rebuild Iraq using those companies. Now, these companies were given contracts worth even hundreds of millions up until billions of dollars. And the sad reality of it is that these companies were hugely unsuccessful in rebuilding the country. I mean, one company was given a contract to build more than 100 hospitals in Iraq, but during the US occupation, only 6 were ever built. This contracting of companies was not at all limited to the rebuilding of Iraq. No, it was very much present in the US Army itself. In fact, at the end of the Iraqi occupation, there would be more contractors working per soldier in the US military. But trust me, guys, hiring a company to do it instead of doing it yourself is much more efficient, of course. And the worst part is that while these companies profited in Iraq, the local population suffered. They suffered so much, and many of them actually wanted elections. They protested during the US occupation for free elections to allow them to take power into their own hands. But these protests were never answered, and in return, many of the people, many of these young men mostly, who were present in these protests and who saw that their protests were not being answered, felt like they had no other choice to join the armed resistance. And this resistance became increasingly violent against the US occupation, and the US military in return reacted with even more violence, causing all of the violence to just spiral out of control and making Iraq look like a war zone for years. Now, the army used extremely drastic measures to fight any opposition, and the methods they used are once again very similar to what was used by Pinochet in Chile and what was used by the Argentinian military junta as well. They used extreme amounts of torture and shock on prisoners who were most of the times just random civilians taken from the streets. They would torture them using the Kubark interrogation manual, and according to the Red Cross, the military even admitted that 70 up until 90% of the people that they abducted were abducted mistakenly and for no reason whatsoever. Sadly though, many of the people abducted were killed, and their bodies were also dropped just in the public next to the streets in order to warn the local population what would happen if you would rise up against the US military. A tactic that was also used by the Argentinian military junta. Now, as I mentioned before, while the population suffered here, the companies, the US companies, profited, and they profited massively. And while they did this, Iraq was reduced to a lawless, violent mess. Thousands of Iraqis were killed each week, and over the entire US occupation, more than 4 million people were displaced and hundreds of thousands of people were murdered. Iraq just goes on to show, probably to the most extreme way, how the US has intervened in other countries to push their ideological reforms pushed by people such as Milton Friedman, who believed that a state of shock could be used in order to push economic reforms, and maybe to a certain extent should even be used to push economic reforms. And in this sense, companies could profit from disasters happening in countries. I'm not saying that the US went into Iraq purely to create a state of shock to do these things. I don't think it was that intentional, but it is definitely the result of the Iraqi occupation and of the US intervention in literally any other country in the past 100 years. And it is a very sad reality. However, what's even worse is that it has not at all ended. To this date, events like this still happen. And even worse, they are increasing. With the increasing occurrence of natural disasters caused by climate change, more and more opportunities arise for disaster, capitalism, and currently we have a very angry orange man in power in the US who is doing a lot to shock the own country. But more on that in the next video. I hope you guys enjoyed the content of this video. I hope you thought it interesting. I hope you learned something new. If you enjoyed, please make sure to like and subscribe, even if you want to leave a comment. But that's it for now. See you guys in the next video. Goodbye.